Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are going on an absolutely fascinating trip into human biology today. We're going to map out the anatomy of the female reproductive system. But instead of just looking at some static, boring map, we're actually going to follow the literal, step-by-step, physical journey of the female gamete, the egg. We'll track it all the way from its origin inside a highly specialized factory, right down its meticulously engineered transit along the reproductive highway. Understanding this journey is absolutely crucial for demystifying reproductive health. It is just a brilliant feat of biological design, and by the end of this explainer, you're going to have a crystal clear mental model of exactly how it all works.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our mental map for today. We'll start with a quick system overview, look at the ovaries, do a deep dive into ovarian tissues, track the fallopian tube pathway, and finally, figure out the mystery of moving the egg.
All right, part 1, system overview. Primary versus secondary organs. To really grasp reproductive anatomy, it helps to split the whole system into two main camps, the primary biological factories and the secondary highways. Let's draw a quick comparison just to ground ourselves. In the male reproductive system, the primary sex organs are the testes. They have two big jobs, producing the gamete, which is the sperm, and secreting the hormone testosterone. Well, the female system mirrors this exact same dual-purpose setup. The primary sex organs are the ovaries. They produce the female gamete, the ova, or the egg, and they secrete the essential primary sex hormones.
So let's look exactly at what these primary roles entail. The ovaries are the primary sex organs because they're handling both the gametes and those crucial steroid hormones. They produce the egg, sure, but equally importantly, they secrete estrogen and progesterone. These two hormones are basically the engine of the female reproductive system. They're entirely responsible for developing female secondary sexual characteristics, things like breast development and body fat distribution, and their monthly hormonal fluctuations drive all the specific physiological changes of the menstrual cycle, which develops and maintains the secondary sexual organs we're about to look at.
Moving right along to part 2, the ovaries, focusing on their structure and function.
And this brings us to a super interesting anatomical difference between the male and female systems. If you remember, the male testes are located entirely outside the abdominal cavity in the scrotum. That's structurally necessary, right? Because sperm formation requires a temperature about 2 to 2.5 degrees Celsius cooler than normal body temperature. But the ovaries, they don't have that temperature constraint at all. They are safely and securely tucked away right inside the lower abdominal cavity, specifically down in the pelvic region. So tucked inside that lower abdominal cavity, females have a pair of ovaries, one on the right, one on the left. They kind of look like almonds, and honestly, they're surprisingly compact. A healthy adult ovary has very precise dimensions, roughly 4 centimeters long, 3 centimeters wide, and 2 centimeters thick. Think of it as a tiny 4 by 3 by 2 centimeter biological powerhouse. Now, because these almond-shaped factories are just sitting inside the lower abdomen, they obviously don't just float around in there. They gotta be firmly anchored. They are actually suspended securely in place by two main connective tissues. First, they're attached directly to the uterus by these fibrous connective tissues called ovarian ligaments. Second, they're tethered to the pelvic body wall by a double-layered peritoneum called the mesovarium. Basically, every single structure is strapped in exactly where it needs to be. All right, part 3, let's do a deep dive into the ovarian tissues. We've seen the outside, but now let's zoom in microscopically to the absolute outermost layer, known as the germinal epithelium. This layer is full of simple cuboidal cells that act as mother cells, the oogonia. These are the cells that eventually go through this complex cellular transformation to become the mature egg. But here is a wild structural opposite for you. In males, that germinal epithelium is buried deep inside the seminiferous tubules. But in the female system, these vital mother cells are wrapped right around the very outside exterior of the ovary. Just beneath that outer layer of mother cells, the ovary needs some serious protection. Enter the tunica albuginea. I know, it's a clunky Latin term, but just think of it as the ovary's armor. Sitting just inside the germinal epithelium, it's this incredibly dense, fibrous connective tissue heavily packed with collagen. Its one and only job is to provide rigorous protection for all the delicate structures waiting inside. If we punch through that armor, the tunica albuginea, we hit the main connective tissue mass of the ovary, called the stroma. This tissue is highly organized into two distinct zones. The inner, central part is the medulla. That's the supply center. It houses all the blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. Surrounding that inner core is the peripheral layer, the cortex. Now, the cortex is where the real magic happens. This is where the ovarian follicles holding the developing eggs actually wait until it's their time to drop. Which brings us to part 4, the fallopian tube and the actual pathway of the egg. So picture this. Our egg has been developing in the cortex of the ovary, and boom, ovulation happens. It's released, and now enters the highway portion of our journey, the fallopian tube, also known as the oviduct. Females have a pair of these tubes extending from each ovary over to the uterus. Each one is roughly 10 to 12 centimeters long. It's a pretty short distance, but it is literally the most critical passage in human reproduction. And this fallopian tube isn't just some standard pipe. It's a highly specialized corridor broken into 3 distinct sections. Step 1 is the infundibulum, which is a funnel-shaped collection point right next to the ovary. Step 2 is the ampulla. This is the widest and longest part of the tube. You can think of it as a specialized waiting room. And step 3 is the isthmus, a much narrower path that finally connects right into the uterus. But wait, how does the egg actually get into the tube in the first place, without just floating off into the empty space of the abdomen? At the very edge of the infundibulum are these amazing structures called fimbriae. They are literally finger-like projections. Just picture them as constantly sweeping, collecting fingers that catch the egg the exact millisecond it's released, pulling it right into the safety of the fallopian tube. So the crucial point is, where does fertilization actually happen? We need to clear up a massive misconception right now. A lot of people think fertilization happens in the uterus. It doesn't. Fertilization happens right out here on the highway, specifically at the ampullary isthmic junction. That's the exact spot where the wider ampulla meets the narrow isthmus. Within this tiny 10 to 12 centimeter tube, that is the precise location where the male and female gametes actually meet and fuse. Finally, part 5, moving the non-motile egg. Let's look at this incredible anatomical engineering. So this brings up a major biological puzzle. Think about this for a second. A sperm cell has a tail, right? It's motile. It can swim. But the female gamete, the egg, is completely non-motile. It has absolutely zero ability to move on its own. So how on earth does a heavy, motionless cell travel from those sweeping fimbriae through the infundibulum and all the way down to that ampullary isthmic junction? To solve this mystery, we've got to look at the actual structural layers of the fallopian tube itself. The outer layer, the serosa, is just connective tissue for structure. The middle layer, the muscularis, uses smooth muscle to create gentle contractions. But I really want to direct your focus to the innermost layer here, the mucosa. The mucosa layer is made of something called simple columnar ciliated epithelium. Let's break that down real quick. Columnar just means these inner cells are tall, like columns. Ciliated is the secret weapon. The surface of these tall cells is covered in thousands of microscopic hair-like structures called kinocilia, and they are motile. They move. They constantly, rhythmically beat in one singular direction toward the uterus. It essentially creates an invisible, microscopic biological conveyor belt that physically sweeps the motionless egg forward through the tube. When you take a step back and look at the whole shebang, it is just breathtaking. From that tiny 4x3 by 2 centimeter almond-shaped factory wrapped in collagen armor, to those sweeping fimbriae fingers, all the way to the microscopic ciliated conveyor belt, every single structure is exquisitely designed for the secure creation and transit of the egg. We've mapped the anatomy and the journey perfectly. But you know, this whole transit is really just the warm-up act for an even greater biological event. Once this carefully transported egg finally reaches that precise waiting room at the ampullary isthmic junction, what complex, instantaneous cellular explosion happens the absolute second a sperm arrives? Well, that is a profound mystery for another explainer. Thanks so much for joining me on this anatomical tour today, and I'll catch you next time.